Good evening, everyone. For our guests, I'm Isla Berman. I'm Dean of the School of Architecture, and I just want to welcome you to the first in our public lecture series this fall. Tonight's lecture is one of our inclusion and equity lectures that we hold each semester. They're supported by the Dean's Office, and this is our third year of the INE series lectures, which we started as a way of furthering our mission as a school to meaningfully engage in social justice efforts through our disciplinary practices and ensure that the environments that we shape are inclusive and equitable in serving all people, we could say, as a fundamental cornerstone of democracy. The INE lectures are therefore dedicated to bringing in leading scholars and designers to the school to share with us who are taking on these issues through their own research, scholarship, and practice. And we are thrilled to have Katherine McKittrick with us this evening from Queen's University in Canada, my home country, I might add, whose work is situated at the intersections of race, gender, and anti-colonial studies. Our lectures each semester are selected by our Inclusion and Equity Committee of the school that's been led and chaired for the last few years by Sheila Crane, our Department Chair of Architectural History, who has done a truly amazing job in moving our INE efforts forward at the school, and who I will pass this off to so that she can introduce our guest this evening. And thank you, Sheila.
Thank you, Isla. It's a real pleasure to welcome Professor Katherine McKittrick to the University of Virginia and the School of Architecture. And I just hope that we might have the opportunity to lure her back when we can do so in person for a follow-up sustained conversation in Charlottesville in the near future. But thank you so much for agreeing to join us in this mode this time. Katherine McKittrick is Professor of Gender Studies and Cultural Studies, as you've heard, at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario. Her capacious interdisciplinary investments are also reflected in her cross-appointment with the Department of Geography and Planning, a nice little echo with our ecosystem. Professor McKittrick's extensive publications have creatively carved out new spaces for understanding intersections across Black studies, theories of liberation and anti-colonialism, cultural geographies, and feminist studies. The recipient of numerous grants and awards, Professor McKittrick is the author of Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartographies of Struggle, which was published in 1906 by the University of Minnesota Press, which is an extraordinary examination of Black women's geographies and geographic thoughts, traced in relation to negotiations of place and conceptions of space articulated by Black women during and after the transatlantic slave trade. A year later, in 2007, McKittrick co-edited Black Geographies and the Politics of Place with Clyde Woods, a wide-ranging series of essays in Black geographic theory. And this project was followed by a pair of essays that I single out from innumerable writings that I could talk about that might be of particular interest to tonight's audience. On Plantations, Prisons, and a Black Sense of Place, that was published in the Journal of Social and Cultural Geography in 2011, and Plantation Futures, published in Small Acts, a Caribbean platform for criticism in 2013. In the face of the sustained echoes of racialized violence linking plantation, prison, and city, McKittrick traces in these essays both geographies of dispossession and spaces and histories of Black life. And that in order to imagine possible collective futures. As she observes, quote, "The geographies of slavery, post-slavery, and Black dispossession provide opportunities to notice that the right to be human carries in it a history of racial encounters and innovative Black diaspora practices that in fact spatialize acts of survival." And it's in part those acts of survival that form the focus of investigation. So McKittrick's first book, Demonic Grounds, ended with an exploration of the wide-ranging work of Jamaican writer and cultural theorist Sylvia Wynter, who became the subject of another book by McKittrick, or that she edited, Sylvia Wynter on Being Human as Praxis, that was published by Duke University Press in 2015. And like Wynter, her subject, McKittrick's own work has been wide-ranging in its subject and modes of address, from her myriad essays and critical writings to musical text performances, and a recent art installation at the Art Gallery of Ontario that was part of a multimedia exploration of the work of another Caribbean writer-philosopher, Edouard Glissant. Her new book, Dear Science and Other Stories, is scheduled to be published by Duke University Press in January 2021. And her talk this evening, entitled Curiosities, Wonder, and Black Methodologies, will give us a glimpse into this project and onto new work that she's currently exploring. So please join me in offering a warm, if somewhat virtual, welcome to Professor Katherine McKittrick.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Sheila, for such a beautiful introduction and for a wonderful overview of my work. I appreciate it so much. I've always said sometimes I think I do the talks for the introductions because it's just, it brings me joy. So thank you. I'm just going to share my screen here. I have some slides. Okay, hang on. I need to walk myself through this slowly. There we go. Okay. I have about, I think, 40 minutes of my talk is about 40 minutes long. As I was saying earlier, this is a new kind of performance for me, so please be generous with how awkward it feels. Many thanks to Sheila for inviting me to share my ideas with you, and to Sneha Patel as well, who has helped me with all the technology and setting up the conversation that we're having. So this presentation is divided into two parts. In the first part, I offer a confession and a reflection, and that section outlines my ongoing preoccupation with methodology and with Black methodologies. The second section turns to alternative methodologies and what Black studies has taught me about how we share and create ideas. So to the confession and the reflection. The confession is that in my own work, I've had an unhappy relationship with the discipline of geography. When we work together, I am fraught and anxious and perpetually underread. I constantly worry about geography because it signals enclosure, material, theoretical, and analytical enclosure. And this is especially relevant to Black and other marginalized communities. Geography is also a discipline that transforms itself according to theoretical and political change, yet it never loses its colonial underpinnings. Of course, I am not the first one to notice this. Geographers, especially feminist geographers and anti-colonial geographers, have drawn attention to how the ownership of geographic knowledge proliferates to refuse but not erase alternative ways of being. Even still, the discipline and its practitioners seduce us with possibility. The everythingness of space and place is exciting. But as we dwell on and theorize and enjoy the everythingness, we suddenly realize that wonderful everythingness is so often imperialism in disguise. The reflection is a writing memory. About a decade ago, I wrote a paper on race, racism, and herbicide. As a way to help me write, I listened to Stevie Wonder's Living for the City and Marvin Gaye's Inner City Blues. I listened to these songs compulsively. I asked Mark Campbell to make me a mashup of the songs. Mark layered samples and sections from Wonder and Gaye atop each other. I also made a little film showing different cities across the globe in distress. Burning cities, bombed cities, terrified cities, cities underwater, destroyed cities, undone cities. The city names were not specific in the film. I relied on the images to delineate the differences and similarities between cities in distress. The idea was that the viewer could both collapse and differentiate, for example, the Watts riots and World War II area bombings and sunken New Orleans. The soundtrack to the film was Mark Campbell's mashup. The original paper was revised and reworked and rewritten and eventually became On Plantations, Prisons, and a Black Sense of Place, which was published in Social and Cultural Geography, as mentioned by Sheila, in 2011. In addition to thinking about the possibilities and limits of herbicide as a concept, that piece also works with the writings of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, specifically her book, Golden Gulag. The map from Golden Gulag by Craig Gilmore, marking state adult prisons, acts as a visual centerpiece to that paper. The Social and Geography paper is dedicated to Clyde Woods as a way to recognize his insistence that Black creatives are central to theories of liberation. So my confession and reflection together highlight some of the key ideas surrounding the production of space and how it relates to Blackness, racial violence, and theorizing difference. The paper is nowhere and nothing without Stevie Wonder and Marvin Gaye. The paper could not have been written without Golden Gulag and the map. A Black Sense of Place, one of the central concepts of the paper, could not emerge without the non-academic, yet theoretically rigorous, creative infrastructures produced by Black people. The geographic underpinnings of the paper are its anchors: cities in distress, prisons, and the analytical habit of reducing Black people and their geographies to objects. I argue that these Black geographies Black geographies enclose, but also provide the conditions to theorize Black life rather than dwelling on social and geographic death. The friendship of Clyde Woods, found in the dedication, is a reminder of beats, grooves, slide guitars, and the political economy of the plantation blocks, but also the expansiveness of heartbreak. The confession and reflection ask that the urban, which for some of us is code for Black, can be theorized as a site that is grounded in spatial infrastructures that cannot be contained by the analytical and geographic perimeters of the city. The city is Stevie Wonder. Whenever I write and whenever I think about the production of space, I want to hold on to all of this: the racial violence, the cities in distress, the beats and grooves, the heartbreak, the songs and the prisons and the plantations, as a way to emphasize that the lesson is not to make and therefore stabilize place, but instead to continually theorize place as relation, and to recognize that this work of theorizing is in itself how Black geographies are lived and expressed. This is for me what Black cities make possible: urban worlds unhinged from the coloniality of place and compromised of secrets and narratives and stories and songs that are sites of learning. The urban, coded as Black, is therefore a poetics of place. What I mean by this is that cities, for some of us, are utterances and sighs and intimate freedoms, thus delineating that the political work of the urban for marginalized communities is less about location and more about ways of living and expressing liberation. The hope is to notice the materiality of geography while also reaching for alternative spatial practices that are obscured by prevailing geographic knowledges. How do we do this? I went to my bookshelves and looked for my geography books specifically on cities. These books included A Social Geography of the City, America's Johannesburg, Cities of Difference, Cities of the Dead, City of Quartz, Dead Cities, Real Cities. Once again, I am reminded that I'm hopelessly underread and that I have a lot of city books written by Mike Davis. I reviewed some journals: Antipode, International Journal of Urban and Regional Research, Society and Space, and so on. In her article, The 21st Century Quest for In her article, The 21st Century Quest for Feminism and the Global Urban, Linda Peake outlines the key debates animating urban studies and urban feminist studies. Her discussion of North, South, productive, unproductive, the planetary urban, and planetary urbanization reveals that the analytical limits of urban studies are tied to gender. This includes the absenting of women and women of color from analyses, the crude categorization of these women and their experiences, the positioning of overdeveloped regions as modern, the construction of the global South as underdeveloped and outside modernity, the inability to grasp how women from non-Western or non-Northern cities are agentive, feminist, geographic, activist. Her article allows us to see very clearly how race and gender and capital shape the kinds of theoretical questions we ask, and how feminist urban futures might be differently imagined through methodology. She ends by bringing together some key theorists and her own observations to argue that how we gather and put together knowledge about our research sites and their inhabitants must be dialogical, provisional, open-ended, generative, border crossing, traveling, revisable. I kept reading and I was reminded of some other works that focus on Black cities. Zenzele Estoke's work on hip hop and the making of urban space in Newark, Marlon Bailey's Geographies of Black drag communities in Detroit, Catching Hell in the City of Angels. These kinds of texts show that unforgiving urban economies provide the conditions for alternative modes of care, creativity, and community. Importantly, the Black city is not simply a site of oppression that is resisted, thus keeping in place existing spatial processes. The Black city is also a site where Black humanity is reinvented outside the logics of racism. Mark V. Campbell's amazingly smart work on Toronto and other Canadian hip hop cities includes exhibits, DJing, remixes, vinyl and cassette archives, documenting graffiti and other creative acts. His curations and research document not just where Black geographies are and who resides within them, but the active remaking of urban infrastructures through co-authorship and relationality across racial identifications. The city, coded as Black, is not a site of authenticity, but instead a location of creative negotiation and conversation and imagination. At the end of her paper on Afropolitanism, Grace Ogunyakin puts an analytical wager on Black women's imagination. Ogunyakin demonstrates how neoliberal urbanization in Ibadan, Nigeria, is undercut by Nigerian women's affective and embodied resistances. She reminds us that it is the imagination that is necessary to and anticipates political action. Ogunyakin's work, like many Black studies texts, centers how crucial the imagination is to the production of Black geographies. Indeed, to put a wager on the imagination as a subversive and meaningful and anticipatory politic is reminiscent of Toni Morrison's important insight that only the active imagination can help me. Or Norbezi Phillips' brilliant work on image, which she writes is a voiced silence that acknowledges but cannot fully encapsulate the brutality of enslavement and the living memory of slavery. The imagination offers a future that is not absolute knowing. The imagination as political enunciation honors the intellectual work of conceptualization without requiring full disclosure of what we are imagining. Put differently, the imagination dreams, but the dream does not have to be fully told or extracted from us. It is the work of dreaming that saves some of us. When the dream occasionally unravels into a material place, we rejoice while also recognizing that most of the dream was not captured by the practice of placemaking. Part of the work of Black studies, and therefore a Black sense of place, is to imagine a racial future outside the perimeters of how we, Black people, are seen in culture. And that's from Elizabeth Alexander and her work on the Black interior. The Black interior, conceptualization and imagination are meaningful because we know that the tendency, reiterated by research outcomes and learning outcomes, is to meticulously track and change and describe oppression and pinpoint and totally know practices of resistance. Because some scholarly work demands that results be expressed in colonial time and space, the unidentifiable is cast aside. The unidentifiable is the imagination. It's also embodiment, not bodies, embodiment. It's also affect, experience, relation, and more. As I've argued elsewhere, the academic move to study as a way to totally know Blackness requires proving and describing Black people as unknowing, unimaginable, unimagining, thus exposing the fullness of objectification and the depoliticization of our Black worlds. Yet there are some days when imagination is all I have. There are some cities that we imagine differently than you. I live in a city that cannot exist without Black imagination. Meticulously tracking, pinpointing, and describing racism and other forms of oppression is tied to unfreedom. Imagination and conceptualization unravel to highlight the significance of creative and collaborative interdisciplinary labor. This combination of conceptualization, imagination, and collaboration and creative output is the fulcrum of what I call Black Atlantic livingness, or what Sylvia Wynter calls being human as praxis. Many Black scholars and creatives provide useful strategies to complement and problematize the question of the urban, because they enact what Ruth Wilson Gilmore calls abolition geographies. What Gilmore so brilliantly offers are placemaking activities that are not territory-based or land-specific, but instead invested in freedom, consciousness, and capacity. The activities are existing, provisional, and still to come. The activities are collaborative and creative lifeways. With this analytical move, Gilmore allows us to imagine the production of space, the city, the urban, as tied to the practice of liberation. Because the work of making place, what she calls abolition geography, quote, takes feeling and agency to be constitutive of, no less constrained by structure. In other words, this is still Gilmore, it's a way of studying and a way of doing political organizing and of being in the world and of worlding ourselves. Feeling, agency, studying, doing, organizing, being, worlding. Or geography is no longer relegated to the study of land, people, infrastructures, and physiography, but is yoked to practices of liberation. Or geography as we know it is realized and lived as a series of verbs and collaborations. Gilmore thus affirms what I've been arguing for several years. Black geography and Black geographies are theorized as verbs by a range of Black and anti-colonial scholars, and this undoes in advance the terribleness of enclosure that so often animates prevailing geographic knowledges. This puts what I've called the Black ungeographic and a Black sense of place to work in productive ways, because it casts placemaking as a set of ideas and rebellions rather than a knowable set of geographies. As verbs, Black geographies are shared as curiosities and strategies without, as Toni Morrison wrote, the mandate for conquest. The idea of where becomes something else altogether. It becomes a praxis that is invested in liberation. What might this look like? I think it means that we take all we have, all the music and the books and the heartbreak and the infrastructure and imagination, and imagine the production of space to be the incomplete and unending gathering of ideas and creative and collaborative labor. I think this means reading widely and teaching each other how to read differently and sharing what has helped us struggle against oppression. I think it also means being okay with opacity. I also think it speaks to Linda Peake's call to reorient our methodological approach, because we cannot delink the production of knowledge from the production of space. No matter how hard we try, we cannot do it. I've tried. When I completed Demonic Grounds, I became increasingly interested in methodology. It has been, in fact, a constant preoccupation because I began to notice that the world of academic methodologies kept denying, erasing, or obscuring the ideas of Black folks. This is not, I want to be clear, a plea to cite Black women or a plea not to cite white men. This is not a plea to cite Black women or a plea not to cite white men. It is a conversation about how methodology can shape the outcome of our research projects, regardless of who we cite. Part of the trouble is that when researching Black and other vulnerable communities, we have been taught to use methodologies that are designed to prove oppression and racial violence. My concern became more and more intense as I noticed that the method, whether this be data collection, surveys, discourse analysis, participant observation, ethnography, theorization, or whatever, I noticed that the method understood in advance that Black people and Black communities were less than human. The method, I came to realize, was already invested in Black social death. The methodology, the procedure of collecting, assembling, and evaluating, sought to study and assess, and sometimes fix, save, recuperate a genre of Blackness that was less than human. This means, of course, that the method cannot imagine or illuminate Black life, Black livingness, and a Black sense of place. This means that Black non-humanity is a scholarly requirement. The methodology, the act of collecting data that leads to a research and learning outcome, is a discursive colonial tool that already knows and therefore reproduces how things already are. The methodology, the act of collecting data that leads to the research and learning outcome, is a discursive colonial tool that already knows and therefore reproduces the idea that Black people are dehumanized. It is this kind of analytical move that I cannot get out of my head. The question of Black humanity either does not enter the equation or is the object of a reparative project that seeks to elevate people to the status of what Audre Lorde called the mythical norm. So not dislodging how things are, but venerating racial capitalism and its white and straight and patriarchal expressions. In order to unthink how things already are, I turned to studying methodology and started tracking and reimagining methodological habits. I've turned primarily to the methodologies in Black and anti-colonial studies as a model because these fields of study have offered a sustained engagement with multidisciplinarity and interdisciplinarity. I've noticed that many Black and anti-colonial scholars are rigorous, which means that they do not just throw ideas together, but that they read widely and deeply and they think relationally. And thinking relationally allows them to come up with something new or different. This not only challenges disciplinary silos that animate our academic and extra-academic worlds, it centralizes the intellectual complexity that undergirds Black ways of knowing and the difficult work of liberation. I would argue too that most Black people live radical interdisciplinary lives, and that this understands that methodology is not only to be the process of gathering information, but can perhaps be a way of being. Some of my work has focused on, and some of my tasks and goals, ongoing tasks and goals and ideas are conceptualizing theory as creative narrative, noticing the creative potential of theory, always insisting that Black creative texts are creative texts. The creative is relational to theory. The creative is relational to theory, but not the object of theoretical inquiry, recognizing how and when and where creative texts provide theoretical insights, not over-celebrating theory as poetic or creative, not over-celebrating the creative as theoretical, hearing music as the production of space, loving music, love music, finding Nurbezi Philip in Toronto, arguing that Nurbezi Philip actually is Toronto, theorizing all creative acts as heretical to the academic form and disciplinarity, showing that disciplinary thinking inside and outside the academy is empire, knowing and demanding and sharing and believing that description is not liberation, reading and rereading The Poetics of Relation, The Intimacies of Four Continents, The Black Atlantic. Sylvia Wynter, Nina Simone, Richard Aiton, Frantz Fanon. Embracing diasporic literacy, reading outside Black studies, reading non-academic texts, reading books I do not like but are informative. Don't be afraid of heartbreak. Study the plantation of the city, but remember the plantation and the city should never be conflated. Study the plantation, do not fetishize the plantation. Remember that plantation futures are extensions of, but do not replicate the plantation. Trust the Black imagination. Put an analytical wager on Black imagination. Reading and rereading, insert everything you have time to read that helped you think about this topic. Positing that the method of interdisciplinarity is rogue or radical, and therefore the process of gathering and sharing knowledge that works toward liberation. Noticing that rogue interdisciplinarity is not a template or predictive. Enmeshing different ideas and different sources to reinvent idea making that exceeds normative ways of knowing. Revising the academic form. Read, reread, and support Black scholars. Read, reread, and support junior Black scholars. Cherishing the academic form. Keep it up, don't wear it down. The story and storytelling are the methodology. Do not fetishize the plantation. Sustain curiosity rather than knowability. Speculating that Stevie Wonder is the only city I know. Noticing that June Jordan gave me a new city. Reading Dion Brand's inventory as purposeful urban study. Sharing ideas. Developing and holding on to with all your heart, radical friendships. With these tasks in mind, I'm going to close with a brief summary of how this all comes together in my forthcoming book. I'm going to veer a little bit outside the geographic disciplinary perimeters of architecture, but I hope this will provide a useful model, at least momentarily, for a version of method making that is curious and capacious rather than colonizing. In my research and writing, I share a series of interdisciplinary stories that are indebted to anti-colonial thought and Black studies. Part of my argument, as I've already noted, is that Black people have always used interdisciplinary methodologies to explain, explore, and story the world, because thinking and writing and imagining across a range of texts, disciplines, histories, and genres unsettles suffocating and dismal and insular racial logics. By employing interdisciplinary methodologies and living in interdisciplinary worlds, Black people bring together various sources and texts to challenge and undo racism. Within Black studies and anti-colonial studies, one can observe an ongoing method of gathering multifariously textured tales, narratives, fictions, whispers, songs, grooves. What is meaningful are the ways in which Black people are interdisciplinary actors, continually entangling and disentangling various narratives, tempos, hues that together invent and reinvent knowledge. This work is rigorous and it's extremely expansive. The practice of bringing together multiple texts, stories, songs, and places involves the difficult work of thinking and learning across many sites, and thus coming to know generously varying and shifting worlds and ideas. Sometimes this is awful because we are gathering dense texts and uncomfortable ideas that wear us out. Sometimes this is awful because we are aware that we cannot know forever, and yet we are committed to the everlasting effort of figuring out how we might together fashion liberation. The rigor is animated by diasporic literacy, Veve Clark's wonderfully useful reading practice that investigates and shows how we already do or can illuminate and connect existing and emerging diasporic codes and tempos and stories and themes. Veve Clark shows that diasporic literacy is structured through recognized references sharing a wealth of connotations. She theorizes Caribbean feminism in literatures, Malhaya Jackson, Kenyan politics, food, furnishings, and laughter as grammars, figures, and practices that are written into creative intellectual texts as prompts. These prompts and literacies function to expand the text outside of itself. Mohaya, Jackson, and laughter are not endlessly explained and unpacked, but instead cue what does not need explanation, but requires imagination, memory, and study, like sorrow songs, like freedom dreams, like erotic, like flying cheekbones. For this reason, I've turned to thinking about how methodology is tied to stories and storytelling. Telling, sharing, and listening to and hearing stories are relational and interdisciplinary and imaginative acts that are animated by all sorts of people, places, narrative devices, theoretical queries, and plots. The process is sustained by invention and wonder. The story has no answers. The story offers an aesthetic relationality that relies on the dynamics of creating, narrating, listening, hearing, reading, and unhearing. The story signals ways of living in a world that denies Black humanity. The story text itself, read aloud or quietly, is an imprint of Black life and livingness, and that tells of the wreckage and the lists and the dance floors and the loss and the love and the rumors and the lessons. The story asks that we live with what cannot be explained and live with unexplained cues and diasporic literacies, rather than reams and reams and reams of positivist evidence. The story opens the door to curiosity. The reams of evidence disappear as we tell the world differently, with a creative precision. The story asks that we live with the difficult and frustrating ways of knowing differentially and knowing difference. And some things we can keep to ourselves. They cannot have everything. Stop her autopsy. They cannot have everything. I focus on stories and storytellings as a way to hold on to the methodological work of sharing ideas in an unkind world. Sharing is not understood as the act of disclosure, but instead signals collaboration and collaborative ways to enact and engender struggle. Stories and storytelling signal the fictive work of theory. I hope this move at least momentarily exposes the intricacies of academic work, where fact-finding, experimentation, analysis, study are recognized as narrative, plot, tale, and incomplete inventions rather than impartial practices and methods. As story, theory is cast as fictive knowledge and insists that the Black imagination is necessary to analytical curiosity and study. Story is theoretical, dance, poem, song, sound, geography, affect, photograph, painting, sculpture, and more. Maybe the story is one way to express and fall in love with Black life. And maybe the story disguises our fall. The story, too, Dina Georgis writes, has the capacity to affectively move us and at the same time incite a listening practice that is neither disengaged nor wanting to master what it sees and hears. It is the function, if the function of the story is to invite the reader, viewer, interlocutor, listener to feel, respond, and be moved, it is also, Ruth Wilson Gilmore reminds us, it also establishes powerful alignments that are put to work with and for loved ones. Gilmore shows how utilizing various narrative devices and reading across materials, photocopies, pamphlets, newsletters, scripture, drawings, announcements, legal documents, and cases and theories. So reading across materials engenders practices of solidarity and collaboration that work within existing and imagining new geographies of liberation. The story is the practice of Black life with and for love. In this way, and as an interdisciplinary methodology, the story is a verb activity that invites engagement, curiosity, and collaboration. The task is, I believe, to get in touch with the materiality of our analytical worlds, draw attention to how Black studies thinks across a range of places, times, genres, texts, grooves that are punctuated with diasporic literacy, and collectively think, know, live Black life as curious, studied, and grounded. The analytics as story allows us to learn and share and get in touch without knowing totally. Thus, as we grieve long-standing racial violences, as we are punched by memories of those we have lost, as we archive the most brutal of punishments, as we are weighed down by losing her, them, over and over, and we know her, and we did not know her, and we did not know their name until it happened. We did not know his name until he was gone. I did not know his name. I cannot know I found the name. I came across her after she was gone. And we feel the heartbreak, and we see it again and again as we study the severity of plantation temporalities then and now, as we are weighed down and the loss is right there beside us as we grieve and we collapse. We do not know absolutely. We must tell and live and generate an ethical distance. I hope to write and share and imagine an ethical distance while recognizing that our collective histories of racial violence put pressure on how we live now. I found her picture. I hope to write an ethical distance and grieve what I cannot know and what we cannot know without industry of objecthood enveloping her. I promise to keep your secret. That's the end.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We have time for some questions. So those of you in the audience, please feel free to chime in with questions and we will field them. And maybe we can start with a question that has come in, which is, what does Black geographies mean?
That's a big question. For me, I think Black geographies can be thought about as spaces and places that are inhabited by Black communities. In terms of three-dimensionality, imagination, at the level of representation. So the environment and our imaginations that surround Black people that are often overlooked by prevailing knowledge systems. They cannot be seen, or are enclosed by prevailing knowledge systems. So they're produced within a particular they're produced in a particular way, for example, as toxic spaces or as quote unquote ghettos. So for me, the most important thing about Black geographies are the paradoxes. How do we think through the material, three-dimensional spatializations of race that tend to enclose Black people and produce the conditions for racial violence? So that's one part. And the other part is, how do we acknowledge and recognize those spaces that cannot be seen through a colonial lens that are produced by Black people in the name of liberation? And for me, it's that doubleness of that produces what Black geographies are. So I think of it as a sense of place, a Black sense of place, which is borrowing from Doreen Massey's work, for those who probably recognize that in there as well. So I think it's important to try and hold all of that together to conceptualize Black geographies.
Let's see, Renia Ehrenfecht has her hand up. I've just unmuted you. If you can ask your question.
So I think possibly she had her hand up from before.
Okay.
So we can go ahead and ask the next question from Shohab. You mentioned in the slides something that says description is not liberation. How might a non-Black researcher interested in sexualized and racialized geographies balance between maintaining the authenticity of lived spatial experiences while also producing liberatory work?
So I think it's, so if we're going to work with the idea that description is not liberation, for me, the first thing, I mean, what I think about in my own work, I don't know if you'll find this useful, but is to pay close attention to the real and imaginative geographies of those communities that you're studying, with an eye on that you cannot know everything, and that there are spatial clues that won't necessarily be uncovered in your research. For me, it's the kinds of research questions that you want to, like, what kind of research questions are you asking of yourself and of the community that you're working with? If the research question is, you know, describe your oppression to me, well, that's the wrong kind of question, right? I think that, you know, if you're going to, if your project is going to be one where you describe vulnerable communities as vulnerable and victims, then that's not really, you know, I don't think you want to reproduce that kind of colonial project. So instead, you might position the community you're working with and or their geographies as legitimate spatial actors that can provide us with clues about what liberation means. And at the same time, so that to me is like a different project altogether. How are people navigating space? How are they talking about liberation? Why can't we ever see how they're expressing their liberation? Do we want to see do we want to see it? And if we see it, what are we going to do with it? So how do we not objectify the worlds of those communities that we're studying, and instead envision them as interlocutors to abolition, to liberation, to freedom, and so on and so forth. So for me, that's where interdisciplinarity comes in. To do that work, to do the work of liberation, we have to bring together multiple texts that allow us to ask new questions, those questions that don't focus on objectification, and then we go from there. But also, as I said at the beginning, keeping in mind that we can't know everything, and that we're not there to excavate and objectify. We're there to imagine new worlds together.
We have one more from, excuse me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Daylena Tinin, which is, can you say more about the analytical limits of geography as tied to gender?
Yeah, I mean, I think I would just say read Gillian Rose's Feminism and Geography. It's such a good book. It's classic. I'm teaching it this year in my Black Geographies class, actually, as a way to introduce a really beautiful study of what happens when women enter space and what happens when feminism enters space. There's so much written on this. I feel like I would be like, and then we can talk about the home, and then we can talk about private and public. So I won't go sort of deeply into that, but I do think that, you know, for me, the work of Linda Peake stands out because she's an feminist urban geographer, and she also works in Guyana and also works with the activist group Red Thread. So she has a lot of insights on what's at stake in terms of bringing not just gender, but race into the conversation around around space, place, and geography. So that's sort of a roundabout way of saying, yeah, like we have to talk about gender and geography all the time. And for me in my work, it's extremely important for me to think about Black feminist geographies and what those look like, and how they're attached to liberation and so on and so forth. So
I can read the next question from Nicole Mayberry. Thank you so much for the beautiful discussion, Dr. McKittrick. In your book, Demonic Grounds, you write about what I understand to be spatial grammars of domination. If stories are grammars or world writing, how do we use storytelling and stories as methods without recreating new spaces of domination?
That's a great question. The first I think the question in itself, you're on your way there because you're understanding stories and storytelling as tied to part of the theoretical infrastructure that you're going to use. So for me, that is another question of interdisciplinarity. How do we, and I say this because I think it's difficult, and it's more difficult than me just saying it here. What's at stake when we position the story and the story and the creative text as intimate interlocutors or intimate friends with a theoretical framework like a Foucauldian framework? So what does it mean to legitimize stories and storytelling in that way, so that they are in conversation with, rather than the object of analysis? And that to me is that's very, very hard to do. But I think what I've noticed in my work with creative texts is that they offer these beautiful, generous, extremely brilliant theoretical insights that the theory can't get at. So for me, it's a matter of playing that game of how do we think about these things in conversation with each other. And another way, as I mentioned, I think somewhat quickly in my paper, is to consider the theoretical framework to be a creative framework. So that's another way to sort of imagine your way out of academic work that is invested in domination.
We have another question from Michael Bacon. He says, I was riven by your statement that she cannot unlink the production of knowledge from the production of space. In my dissertation work that I'm trying to complete right now, I keep conflating these. And what I have felt like was a mistake, I can't keep from making over and over again, as I use methods designed for one to analyze the other. I would be grateful if you would discuss that link a bit more. Thank you for your presence today.
Yeah, the link between the production of knowledge and the production of space. Yeah, you can't. You can't. And I think that that's the trick. Geography is a tricky, complicated discipline because it works with spatial processes while those spatial processes are naturalized around us, and we act as though they're not quote unquote man-made or human-made. It's as though we just, as Neil Smith says, space just is, right? Space just is. And if space just is, there's this idea that there isn't a whole discursive story that is producing space in that way. But I think once we know that, and once we're aware of how socially produced all three-dimensional environments and how socially produced everything around us is, including space, or how we recognize how colonialism informs the production of space, then we can kind of get to the more interesting questions about how they cannot be delinked. I mean, for me, it's like the fusing of them allows us to see that space is actually alterable, right? Because if space is so intimately tied up, if the production of space is so intimately tied up with knowledge, then if we shift our knowledge system, then the production of space, or how we produce space, might shift as well. So that's, I think, one of the more exciting things I found around, like, came across. I've learned from radical geographers, from feminist geographers, from Black geographers, is that space is alterable, and because it's so intimately tied to knowledge, we do have the capacity to shift, and so that it's not just this natural empty container that we walk around in sort of aimlessly. I don't know if that answers your question, but you know, I just want to say, yeah, keep going.
Okay, so we had another question from Stephen Nelson. Says, thank you for such a wonderful, brilliant talk. I'm fascinated by your introduction of, sorry, ethical distance. Can you talk more about this concept? Thank you.
Yeah, I can try. It's something I'm still working on. And I think that we all should be working on, which is how do we grapple with the visual surplus of anti-Black violence, and how do we talk about it when we're called up constantly to talk about it, and often the request to talk about it is to basically repeat the racial violence rather than do an analysis of that racial violence. And so for me, I think we have to create an ethical distance. It doesn't mean that we have to talk, we don't talk about anti-Black violence. We don't talk, you know, if we saw the video, name any number of them, how do we talk about that in a way that respects Black people and other marginalized and vulnerable communities? How do we, and so, yeah, so I don't have like an easy answer to that, but I'm constantly asking myself, is my conversation, is my writing profiting from talking about anti-Black violence? Am I getting something from this, or is my audience getting something from this that is a new form of violence? And so for me, the first thing is like asking ourselves that question. And also, yeah, so when we do engage with the brutality of racist violence and white supremacy, and we're so angry, sometimes it's okay to just be like this is fucked, and that's it, right? Like sometimes it's okay to just be angry and not have to explain why. Sometimes it's okay not to respond. Sometimes it's okay to respond in a very sophisticated manner and not detail what happened, to what we like, not to sort of repeat the violence. So I think there are a number of strategies to think it through and to create that ethical distance. But like I said, I mean, I think it's ongoing. I think that, you know, I've mentioned this in other talks, and I've mentioned it. There's sometimes when I teach in my Black feminist thought class, and I leave that class and I think I should have shown them images because I don't think they believe it's this bad. That's a mostly white student population, right? So I'm like, what is it about the image that will, why do I think the image will, and I've never done it, but there is something pedagogical about the brutality of it, where I question it and I wonder, because they are rolling their eyes when I'm talking about lynching, and I don't think that's right. And so, yeah, so like I said, it's something I think that we're continually working on, and I think different Black scholars attend to it in very, very different ways, and I respect every single way that they do it. It's just, to me, it's like, yeah, so you make your decisions. I think the key is to think through, you know, is there a currency behind this? And the moment there's a currency, you want to maybe take some more time.
There's another question from the audience, an anonymous questioner who says, what other Black musicians do you draw inspiration from? Side note, your Black mathematics essay pairs so well with Mathematics by Yaslin Bey. Thank you for everything you've done and will do in the future.
That's so nice. Yeah. Oh, well, Betty Davis. You know, I'm listening to, is it Little Sims, who's a British hip hop person right now. And I don't know, I just have, I just have just mountains and mountains of music that I love. I love listening to music. I actually find that music is a wonderful has a wonderful theoretical friendship with Black studies, because it can say things that theory can't say, yet at the same time, we can never describe what it's doing because it makes us feel so damn good. So.
The next question is from Amanda Hayton. How does one approach investigating and understanding sense of place? And how would you define the concept of sense of place? I've been interested in this topic ever since reading Bell Hook's book, Belonging, and thank you for this beautiful presentation.
So, I mean, to do some theory, or like just do, for me, like I said, I started with Doreen Massey's essay. I think it's called A Global Sense of Place, where she's thinking about multiple, transnationalism, and thinking about how different types of knowledges and geographies sort of intersect in one place at the same time. So I would start with an essay like that, and I would also look at Lisa Lowe's Intimacies of Four Continents to think about those kinds of processes, where it's all this, like, just her discussion of different, the ways that silk sort of the ways that a material object sort of moves around the world, and ends up in a story in Vanity Fair and things like that. So for me, a sense of place allows us to think about multiple diasporic locations emerging, in different local contexts, temporal, across time and space. And then I like, those are two examples that are not in my work. And in my work, I'm trying to imagine a sense of place as, it began with a pairing of the discipline of human geography and Black studies. That's how it began. I was like, what will happen when these two disciplines come together, and what will the outcome be? And so in Demonic Grounds, it's awkwardly termed Black human geographies. I really wish, I'll revise that someday. I'll go back and rewrite that book. But it unraveled from there as a Black sense of place, which was, and this speaks to the very first question that was asked, as in, what is Black geography? Which is, it's trying to get at the multiplicity of spatial experiences, even those that are not representable, and attributing that to a particular Black diasporic consciousness. And the diasporic consciousness for me is linked to the struggle for liberation. So a Black sense of place is always a struggle for liberation. It's not just, a demarcated location. Instead, it's, like I said, it's a verb. It's something that we do, it's not a specific place, it's something that we do. So that's how I'm thinking about it.
Larissa Lima de Souza thanks you for sharing so much, and asks, what is the importance of corporeity in the Black methodologies? And I think later she asked corporeity and performances.
Does she mean corporeal? Like corporate?
Well, that's what I was thinking, but
yeah, like embodiment.
Yeah.
I think, because I don't know if I could answer something on corporate.
No, corporate.
So,
In relation to the corporeal.
I think. Okay. I'll do my best there. Yeah, I think so. What is the significance of, I'm going to say embodiment because it's just easier for me to say, or the embodiment and performance. For me, it's very important. Part of the part of my early work in demonic grounds is on the slave auction block. So it is about what's at stake in positioning Black people in geography in this way, where their entire being is reduced to a performance. And for me, the significance of the performance within the context of the production of space is relevant precisely because it simultaneously affirms the brutality of white supremacy while also not being prepared for the subversions that will go on through the performance and the embodiment. So to give an example from that book, you know, the slave auction block scales up and produces a particular type of Black objecthood, yet at the same time, the enslaved continually subverted that process by acting sassy on the auction block, by killing themselves, by, you know, there's a whole range of ways that the enslaved undid the performance, the embodied performances that were demanded of them. So to me, that contradiction is always at play when we're thinking about the corporeal and when we're thinking about Black performances.
I think we had somebody in the audience raise their hand, Perry. I've unmuted, if you're there, I've unmuted you. Maybe not. I guess we can move on to the next. Oh, sorry, Rachel Newman. Also raised your hand.
Hi, thank you so much for that. I was weeping and glad I'm in the privacy of my own room. That was so liberatory, and that is actually what my question is about. So I write about the colonial Caribbean, and liberation means something different than to what it means now. And I'm just wondering, what does liberation mean to you?
It means friendship, like radical friendships, collaborations, and yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to define it when we're still struggling for it. But for me, that those two things are important, and they provide moments of liberation. Yeah.
We have another question. What is the relationship, if any, between Black geographies and urban history, urban studies? I would think a lot.
Yeah, I would. I mean, there's a long history there. So you would look, I mean, sorry, I often do this because I'm not, and then this is where I say I'm not a geographer or an urban geographer or an urban planner. And then I like, but that's where you read the work of Joe Darden, you know, on Detroit. You read the work of Willie Wright, more recent work of Willie Wright. Adam Bledsoe, like there's a lot of Black geographers in the past and the present, and there is a long relationship there. What I noticed in my early research was that often the ways in which the urban was talked about in relation to Black people was through the trope of the ghetto. And there was this insistence, this is with the exception of Black geographers, but there's this insistence that the urban, you know, I mean, it was almost like a social experiment. So Black people live here and they live in poverty, and then we will map them as such, and therefore that proves that they are you know, less than human or whatever. So there is a long relationship there, I think, between urban studies, urban theory, and Black geographies. But I'm definitely not an expert in it. But I think, like I said, I think there's a lot of amazingly smart work that's already exists and is definitely coming out that makes that thinks outside of that, what I just said, that sort of objectifying urban studies model, and instead looks at Black people as makers of urban space, and doing that through the struggle for liberation.
So we have a couple of questions that are connected about authorship. I'm wondering if you have thoughts about authorship, singular, multiple, collaborative in the storytelling method. In other words, as we read across disciplines, across media, across authors, how does this require a new conception or model of authorship altogether?
I mean, for me, it's a hopeful model. I think reading across texts encourages us to share ideas differently. And if we're sharing ideas differently, then our citational practices will follow. So I think one of the more sort of one of the things that I've tried to do in my work, and I don't know if it's successful, is to use the practice of referencing and citation as capaciously as I can, which means that because I know that there are things that I cannot capture in the text itself. So if I capture it in the reference and the bibliography and the citation, then perhaps I can sort of reorient how the text is read without me owning the text itself. And so that's sort of a long way of saying, I think that we can bring together multiple texts across, like in our work. We can author those texts as singular authors, but it's our responsibility as singular authors to continually question what singular authorship means. So I got here by doing this, you know. I could not write this book without, and that's with and beyond acknowledgements. And so I don't know if that answers your question, because it's a difficult one for me to answer. I do know that, you know, after I worked with Sylvia Wynter on our long conversation, because I was intimidated by co-authorships. I did one co-authorship with my supervisor when I was a grad student, but I was intimidated by them. But after I did that conversation with Wynter, I started to seek out other collaborations with grad students, with friends, with musicians, whatever I can do to kind of put together a project that doesn't sort of hold steady some sort of expert about, you know, Black geographies or whatever it would be. So that's a sort of a, I'm not sure how to answer your question, but this is what I do.
Perry Meldon also had raised, his or her hand, but has written in the chat, I'm curious if Dr. McKittrick has consulted on exhibits or in public history spaces. I'm especially curious on her interpretation of spatiality in museums, exhibits, or public history projects.
I have not. I've actually had the wonderful experience of people using my work to launch exhibits. I've had a couple of, I've had my work appear in the quote unquote white space or the white cube, I guess. But I haven't consulted. I've thought about it, but mostly through my students who do work in that area. So I would just give a nod quickly to like Yanni Ali and other students who have worked more closely with the museum space and the sort of uncomfortable, you know, coloniality of those spaces, and what it means for Blackness to enter that space. And in terms of museums, I mean, I think as well, I mean, again, so this isn't my area, but I really like Perry Carter's work on plantation museums. He, with Derek Alderman and I think maybe Josh Inwood, but Perry stands out to me because I know his work the best. You know, interviewing people as they exit plantation museums and what's at stake in that. It's really, really good public history, very, very smart work on what the plantation means now for Black and non-Black people who visit those spaces.
I'm going to jump to another question from Maria Luisa de Barros Rodriguez, who says hello from Brazil, and thanks you for the talk. She would like to know a little bit more about the role of music, how music is used to elaborate the investigations and Black methodologies for thinking about the city and urban space from a Black perspective in America.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's, I mean, it is the soundtrack to Black geographies. Music provide a soundtrack to Black geographies. There's a lot of ways we can think about this. I think about it through the work of Clyde Woods, who has a beautiful model for thinking about the blues as a critique of plantation economies. And so he is exemplar in terms of the interdisciplinary questions I've asked myself about what music can quote unquote do, right? And how it allows us to transform space, and how it's not just sort of window dressing to the discipline of geography or the subdiscipline of Black geographies. So so his model, you know, it allows us to see how Black creatives and Black cultural producers are necessary to reimagining the actual materiality of space. And so you see in the blues, you see you don't just see a critique of racism, you see a total reimagining of the production of space. And it's in his book, and I apologize if you've read this, the person who asked the question, but his book is so damn comprehensive. Like, it is thick. It's just so beautiful. So it allows us to think about how Black music has the capacity for change and for social change. And in my work, I pair that with, or I extend that with, the affective and physiological beauty, like the gift of music, which allows us to feel good and allows us to feel sad and think about things, and it just brings some of us so much joy. And for me, that's thinking about that alongside those social changes that Clyde outlines in his book that's life-changing. I think it shows the potential of the creative text. So yeah.
I have a question here from CC that I think really gets at some of the problems of colonial methodologies. And CC says, I find the concept you mentioned, stalker autopsy maybe, of they cannot have everything, really compelling and also curious given the collaborative nature of the urban. I sense a push-pull of further developing Black cartographies for their potential understanding, but also an almost proprietary nature of some mysteries that cannot be or should not be communicated to the others. Is there more you can expand on this topic?
I feel like that question answered that question. I mean, I love the text questions. I'd be like having those long. No, I think that, yeah, I think you're exactly right. It is a contradiction. Like, it is a contradiction. There is this desire to know and share ideas. But there is a responsibility that we don't have to share everything. And so I'm okay with that contradiction. And I think we should be. I think that that's what we have to live with. That's what it means to be Black, right? Like that's it. It's like, it's this awful, terrible contradiction that's never resolved. But the key is for me that it's ongoing and it's always working toward a different world. So that's how I would answer that question. I think this goes back to the question that was asked earlier around, like, how do we think about, you know, how do we attend to you know, racist violence? Like, what do we do with that? How do we create an ethical distance? And part of that is just living with the contradiction that is imposed on us and the weight of that, without having to explain it all the time. Just constantly explaining it. It's okay if you need to take a nap and not explain that. So that's how I would answer that question.
Katherine, is it okay to ask a few more questions?
Sure, yeah.
So this is from anonymous attendee. I'm fascinated by this idea of placing an analytical wager on the Black imagination and concepts of authentic commitment in research methodologies. I'm curious how those manifest themselves in your work and what it takes to build trust and deep relations to do liberatory work.
Sorry, Chazal, can you read that last little bit, what it means to trust?
And deep relationships to do liberatory work.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about the first part of the question first, which is around the imagination and the importance of the imagination, and thinking about the representations in the archive of Blackness that sort of where imagination isn't possible. And scholars like Toni Morrison, or now more recently Saidiya Hartman, using those archives as a place to recreate Black life on its own terms outside of the archive. And so I think that that's the kind of, I personally don't do creative work in my own research and in my own writing, but I think that those are two examples of what can be done and what can be opened up in terms of trusting the imagination without exploiting it. In my own work, I love the academic form. I adore it. I'm actually in love with the academic form. So for me, I like to use the academic form as the narrative that allows me to recreate worlds, and be as creative as I can with the academic form and interrupt it as well. I don't know if that's getting at the question, but that's where that took me.
Well, we have now, I mean, your talk has generated the incredible explosion of generative questions. And I apologize to members of the audience whose questions we don't have time for. But I also recognize that we've now been having Katherine McKittrick under the questioning lens for a very long time. So
it's a defense. It's a defense.
but I think, you know, at a moment when UVA's School of Architecture, schools of architecture across North America are thinking about what it means to try to decolonize design, that you've given us lots of tools for thinking capaciously and with much curiosity about what our role might be in this in these ongoing conversations. So thank you so much for your talk, and thanks to all of the wonderful members of the audience for your participation.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you, Katherine. It was really amazing. Fantastic conversation and wonderful talk.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Now is when you have to imagine the explosion of clapping. That's the one that we haven't quite managed.
It's happening in the chat. The chat's blowing up with thanks and thanks and thanks and how wonderful it is. So
that's great.
Consider that the silent clapping.
Okay, okay. Thank you, everybody.